Before this argument begins, I need you to challenge everything you think you know about Africa and its origin. What started this for me was a young black person sitting alone in a car, teary-eyed, in pain. I saw them on YouTube. They asked simply, why is it that black people are universally hated? What did we do exactly to deserve this? That question haunted me for 3 years, and now I have come to understand the answer is nothing. The full answer cannot begin where the wound begins. The answer cannot begin with the ships, with the chains, with the auction blocks. The actual answer begins much earlier than that, before the first star was named, before the first breath drew air, before the first civilization rose from the dust of this ancient earth. There is a witness, a presence that sees everything being built, everything being taken, and everything that will come after. The one who set the lights in the heavens as signs before any human eye existed to read them. The one who spoke the covenant into existence in Genesis 15:13 and Deuteronomy 28:68, 4,000 years before the first ship sailed. Nothing that is being done to his people has ever left his sight, not for a single moment, not for a single generation. So this is not an argument. This is a declaration, and it begins where the record begins, in Africa, not in chains, not in suffering, in the beginning. Before this argument begins, before the theology, before the evidence, before the conclusion, there is a recorded history, not an interpretation, not a supposition, an authentic record. The record begins in Africa, not in chains, not in a hold of a ship, not on a plantation, and certainly not in suffering. Did anyone ever tell you that? It begins in mathematics that calculated the movements of stars before Greece had a name for the sky. In medicine that performed surgical procedures Europe would not attempt for another 1,000 years. In architecture that carved entire churches from solid rock, descending into the earth, centuries before Europe's greatest cathedrals broke ground. In scripture so ancient that the Church of Ethiopia was guarding it centuries before the rest of Christendom existed to condemn it, and kept it anyway when they did. In governance that codified justice into law centuries before the concept of democracy had a name anywhere else on earth. In astronomy that read the heavens like a language and understood what they were saying, long before the rest of the world thought to look up. In wealth so vast that kings who had never seen Africa were already living in its shadow. How does it feel to come from that heritage? Remember that. Africa was not the beginning of a wound inflicted by white supremacy. Africa was the beginning of the world. For centuries the record was rewritten, not by time, not by loss, nor by carelessness. They called it the Dark Continent, but it was never dark. It was blinding. You were not taught what Africa was. You were taught what they needed you to believe. Then came the ships. Between 1500 and 1900, more than 12 million human beings were taken from the African continent by force, packed into the holds of vessels, carried across the Atlantic. Millions died in the crossing. Those who survived arrived as property. In 1619, the first enslaved Africans arrived at Point Comfort, Virginia. And the nations that did this, the crowns, the companies, the captains, the clerks who filed the paperwork, they did not pay for it, not in any court, not in any meaningful measure. The wealth they built from stolen bodies became the foundation of the modern world, and they called that foundation civilization. Leopold killed 10 million in the Congo. He died in his bed, wealthy, decorated, mourned. There was no tribunal, no reparations, no punishment for his crimes. That gap between what was done and what was answered for is not a small thing because nothing has been answered for. It is the indictment to come. And yet, despite the horrific atrocities of humanity that sheds so much innocent blood in lust of domination, God is not late. 4,000 years before the first ship sailed, God spoke this moment into the covenant of Genesis 15, Deuteronomy 28, and the book of Enoch before it was created. Not to justify it, not to sanctify the suffering, but to declare that no power on earth could destroy the people he had chosen to endure it. The affliction was anticipated. The perpetrators are marked for judgment, and no empire on earth has the power to dismiss it. In 1921, the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, was one of the most prosperous black communities in American history. Black Wall Street. On the night of May 31st, a white mob supported by city officials and biplanes dropping incendiary bombs destroyed it in hours. 35 city blocks, more than 1,400 homes and businesses, as many as 300 people killed. The records were removed. The archives disappeared. It was not in the textbooks for decades. They did not just commit the wound. They attempted to erase the memory of it. They burned it. They buried the records. They called it a riot, because they could not call it what it was. But you don't spend decades erasing something that doesn't matter. The erasure is its own confession. Emancipation came in 1865. What followed was not freedom. It was a renegotiation of the terms of bondage. Within months, Southern states passed the Black Codes, laws that criminalized unemployment, laws that criminalized movement, laws that handed newly freed men back to the same fields under a different name. Sharecropping kept families in debt that could never be repaid, by design. Convict leasing sent black men to plantations and mines in chains. The 13th Amendment had left a hole. They found it immediately. Then came Jim Crow, separate and unequal, enshrined in law, enforced not just by courts but by lynching, by rope, by fire, by crowds that brought their children to watch, by body parts given out as souvenirs, tokens to remember a good picnic by. Emmett Till was 14 years old. They mutilated him. His mother insisted on an open casket because she wanted the world to see what they had done to her child. The men who did it were acquitted. Then they confessed. Because they could. Because his life carried no protected value in the eyes of that system. That was not an accident. That was the message. When Jim Crow fell, redlining rose. Federal policy explicitly denied black families access to home ownership, to generational wealth, to the one mechanism by which most Americans build stability across generations. Mass incarceration rebuilt convict leasing under new paperwork. And tonight, not in 1950, tonight, somewhere in America a mother or a father is sitting on the edge of a bed. Their son is maybe 12, maybe 16, and they are choosing their words carefully because they know that the wrong encounter, the wrong moment, the wrong officer on the wrong night could end his life. They tell him, keep your hands visible. Don't reach for anything. Don't raise your voice. Don't run. Say yes, sir. Say no, sir. Come home. This is not a conversation about manners. This is a survival briefing. And every black parent in America knows exactly what I'm talking about. This is what evil looks like when white supremacy learns to wear a uniform. This is the inheritance. This is what 400 years looks like when the clock is still running. And the last strategy is so diabolical and insidious, it will make your flesh crawl. Recently, not in 1850, not in 1965, as recently as March 25, 2026, the United States of America walked into the United Nations General Assembly and voted no. The question before 193 nations was whether to declare the trafficking of enslaved Africans the gravest crime against humanity. This was not a binding resolution. It would cost nothing. It would obligate nothing. It was simply the world asking, will you say this was wrong? 123 countries said yes, and 3 nations, in sheer defiance and arrogance, said no. That's not a legal position. That's a posture. That's who they are. That's cruelty. China, a nation with no ships in that Atlantic, no plantations built on that suffering, looked at this resolution and said yes. The United States, whose entire economic foundation was built on it, looked at the same resolution and said no. And then there were the 53 who said nothing, who chose silence over truth, who sat in that chamber and decided that their comfort was worth more than their conscience. Those 53 did not abstain out of ignorance. It was calculated. The United Kingdom, France, Portugal, Spain, Belgium, the Netherlands, the nations that built the ports, that drew up the contracts, that sent the ships, that wrote the laws that made it legal, that profited for centuries from what was done. And when the world asked them simply to say, this was wrong, they abstained. That is not neutrality. That is a choice. The vote was held on the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery. They chose that day. They cast that vote. They sat in that silence. It was their version of pleading the fifth. And it is almost always the guilty who fear incrimination. Then they spoke. And this is what they said. The official justification from the United States was this: we do not recognize a legal right to reparations for historical wrongs that were not illegal under international law at the time they occurred. Hear what is being said. They did not break the law because there was no law to break. It did not exist yet. They are using the silence of the law as their alibi. By that logic, murder did not exist before it was written down. Theft did not exist before there was a code against it. Evil does not count until someone finds the paperwork. But this is not about law. It is about humanity. What was done to African people between 1500 and 1900 had never been done before at that scale. Never. Not in all of recorded history. The law had no words for it because no one had ever done it before. They were committing an act so vast, so systematic, so without precedent in the history of the human race that civilization itself had not yet found language to name what they were doing. They outran the law. And as recently as March 25, 2026, in a marble chamber in New York City, they stood before the world and called that silence a defense. They are still running. This is not a revelation. This is just another entry on a list that has never stopped growing. The same nations, the same argument, the same refusal, the same silence. Add it to the record. Not illegal, just inhuman. They said it out loud, in a marble chamber, in front of the whole world. And they meant it. Is there anything else left to question perpetual systems of evil that have been built to satisfy the bloodlust for greed and power?